Hey, no, hang on. You can't just walk in. Who are you? You live here? Because I don't think you do.
Ma'am, I'm the maintenance tech. I work for the complex.
Prove it. People keep sneaking in here. I don't know you.
I understand. This is my key fob. I'm opening the building to fix a leak on the 3rd floor.
Anyone could say that. Let me see a badge or something.
My badge is clipped right here.
When the gate slid shut behind Trisha's car for the last time, the complex exhaled in a way no one said out loud, but everyone felt. Life resumed. Kids running down the steps toward the pool, neighbors hauling grocery bags inside, delivery drivers weaving through the parking lanes. But something about the place felt sharper, clearer, as if the entire community had been reminded of how easily things could spiral when assumptions take the place of simple conversation. DeAndre stayed late that evening. Contractors had finished the new fire door installations, and he walked each hallway inspecting the work. He didn't do it because he had to. He did it because the property wasn't just paperwork to him. It was a legacy, a responsibility, something his father had entrusted him with long before he ever realized what ownership truly meant. As he reached the end of the 3rd floor, he paused by a window overlooking the courtyard. A few residents were gathered below, talking quietly, sipping iced tea, watching the last bit of daylight settle across the pavement. Ava spotted him first and raised a hand. "Hey, Mr. Willis," she called gently. "Everything good up there?" He leaned slightly out the window. "Looks good. Contractors did solid work today." Damon joined in the conversation from below. "You handled everything this week better than most people could have." DeAndre gave a small shrug. "Doesn't feel like there was much to handle. Just a misunderstanding that turned into something bigger than it needed to be." Ava shook her head. "It wasn't just a misunderstanding. She treated you like you didn't belong, and you stayed calm through all of it. That matters." He didn't respond right away. Moments like these always sat heavily on him, not because they were new, but because they never should have happened in the first place. "I appreciate that," he finally said. "But calm only goes so far. What actually makes the difference is how people respond when they see something wrong. You two stepped up. That mattered more than anything I said or didn't say." Ava glanced at Damon, then back up at him. "We just didn't want things to get worse. And that's enough sometimes," DeAndre replied, stopping something before it turns into something else. They chatted a bit longer. Nothing heavy, nothing dramatic. Just neighbors. People trying to make a community feel like a place where everyone could walk around without being questioned for simply existing. Later that night, after the courtyard emptied and lights flickered off across balconies, DeAndre locked up the last maintenance room and headed toward his truck. The complex was quiet now, not the strained silence of confrontation, but a peaceful, earned quiet. He paused for a moment halfway across the lot, looking at the buildings rising around him. He thought about his father. How many times he'd repeated the same lesson growing up. Respect is cheap. Pride is expensive. Don't confuse the two. It wasn't until moments like these that DeAndre understood exactly what those words meant, because a whole conflict had started with pride. The kind that refuses to ask a simple question. The kind that assumes the worst. The kind that pushes forward even when the truth is placed plainly in front of it. And that pride had cost someone their home. But respect, the thing she had refused to offer, could have stopped the entire confrontation at any point. A single sentence could have changed the entire morning. A simple, "Hey, do you work here?" Or, "I'm new, just checking." Or even, "Sorry, didn't know." That would have ended everything, but she chose something else. And in choosing it, she learned something the hard way. Meanwhile, the complex learned too. People talked about it less as days went by, but the moral lingered. Assumptions carry weight, and when thrown carelessly, they can land on someone else like a stone. Weeks later, a new tenant moved into Trisha's old unit. A young teacher from Phoenix, quiet, respectful, friendly. She waved at neighbors when she passed them, asked questions instead of making accusations. The community settled around her naturally, and life continued. But anyone who had been there that morning kept the memory close, not because they wanted to relive it, but because it reminded them of something too important to forget. Just because you don't recognize someone doesn't mean they don't belong. Just because something feels unfamiliar doesn't make it wrong. And the quickest way to create conflict is to assume you're the only one who sees the truth. Before leaving for the night, DeAndre clicked off the courtyard lights and whispered the same thing he wished Trisha had understood. Respect isn't optional. He didn't say it loudly. He didn't say it for anyone else. It was the kind of line meant to sit quietly in the air, meant to be carried home by anyone willing to listen. And now that you've listened through this entire story, here's the message meant for you. Whoever you meet, wherever you are, choose respect first. It costs nothing. It changes everything. And it might be the difference between building a community or breaking one apart. If you want more stories that hold a mirror to real life, stories that make you think, reflect, and pay attention to the world around you, make sure you subscribe. There are many more to tell, and each one carries a lesson worth hearing. Trisha returned to her apartment later that day with a forceful swing of her front door, as if shutting it hard enough could keep the world outside from judging her. She dropped her keys on the counter, paced across the living room twice, then yanked open the blinds to look toward the courtyard below. People were still out there, talking, walking their dogs, carrying groceries, and every time someone glanced even briefly in her direction, she felt her chest tighten. She wasn't used to being on the wrong side of a conversation. She wasn't used to being the topic everyone whispered about. And for the first time since she moved in, she didn't feel in control of anything. She spent the next hour typing a long, emotional email to management, explaining, clarifying, insisting. She wrote that she felt unsafe, that she reacted instinctively, that she was simply standing up for her community. She said she was being unfairly judged. She said the videos didn't capture her real intentions. Then she deleted the entire message. Then she rewrote it. Then she deleted it again. By the time she worked up the nerve to walk toward the leasing office, her palms were damp, and she rehearsed her speech over and over, telling herself she was right, that she deserved to be heard, that people were overreacting. When she stepped inside, Riley and Nora were both seated. They weren't smiling. They weren't cold either. They simply had the look of people who had already made a difficult decision. "Trisha," Riley said gently, "thank you for coming." She straightened her posture. "I want to file a formal complaint about how I was treated today." Riley exchanged a quick glance with Nora, then folded his hands on the desk. "Before you do that, we need to discuss something important." Her stomach dropped. "What something?" Nora opened a folder, the same one containing documents and statements gathered since morning. "We take community conduct very seriously," she began. "And after reviewing the videos, the witness statements and previous reports," Trisha's voice cut through the room. "Reports? What reports? Nobody told me about any reports." "There have been several," Nora said carefully. "About confrontational interactions, approaching visitors aggressively, questioning tenants in shared spaces, and today's incident raised significant concerns." "That's not fair," Trisha said sharply. "I have every right to make sure this place is safe." "You do," Riley replied. "But you don't have the right to single out residents or staff. And you definitely don't have the right to threaten someone, especially the owner, with police action when he hasn't done anything wrong." Trisha's voice shook. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "No," Riley said softly but firmly. "We're addressing a pattern." Silence flooded the room. Then Riley slid a letter across the desk. The header read, "Notice of lease termination. 48 hours to vacate." Her breath hitched. "What? What is this?" "It means we're ending your lease," Nora said. "We're giving you the required notice period. You'll need to gather your belongings and turn in your keys." "For what?" Trisha demanded. "For asking a question? For being cautious?" "For creating a hostile environment for other residents," Riley replied. "For ignoring multiple attempts from neighbors to defuse a situation. For escalating a confrontation with the property owner. For refusing to de-escalate. And for previous complaints that show this wasn't an isolated incident." Trisha shook her head slowly, disbelief spreading across her face like a shadow widening across a wall. No, this is wrong. You can't do this. I pay my rent on time. I keep to myself. You don't keep to yourself, Nora said gently. You go after people. That's the issue. And after today, we can't ignore it anymore. Trisha pressed her hands against the edge of the desk. You're choosing him over me. We're choosing fairness, Riley said, and safety. For everyone. She took a shaky breath. So that's it? I'm just gone? You're welcome to appeal, Nora said. But the decision is final unless new information changes the situation. Trisha didn't grab the letter right away. She stared at it, her expression moving from shock to anger to something she didn't recognize. I can't believe this, she whispered. Then she turned, walked out, and let the door close behind her. 2 days later, neighbors watched from their balconies as she lifted boxes into the trunk of her car. Some watched quietly. Some whispered. Some didn't look at all. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't wave. She didn't defend herself. She kept her eyes low, her movements rigid, her shoulders trembling as she shut the trunk for the last time. Across the courtyard, DeAndre stood beside the contractor van reviewing notes for the next project. He didn't stare. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply watched long enough to make sure everything was calm. Then he turned back to his work. Morning, Mr. Willis, a neighbor called out gently. He nodded once. Morning. Nothing more. Nothing less. He wasn't interested in humiliation or payback. He didn't need an apology to keep doing his job. But he did hope, quietly, that she learned something on her way out of the parking lot. But even after the car rolled through the gate for the last time, the lesson from that morning stayed behind, echoing through every hallway she'd once walked. But there was still one final message to share, one the audience needed to hear just as clearly as she did. By early afternoon, the tension that started as a morning confrontation had turned into something larger. Not chaotic, not loud, but present, like a conversation echoing through walls and stairwells, sibyls, carried from one resident to another, until nearly everyone in the complex had a version of the story. People paused by their mailboxes longer than usual. Others lingered in the breezeways, lowering their voices when Trisha passed. She felt it instantly. The shift, the stares, the uncomfortable silence whenever she walked by. On her way to collect a package, she overheard two neighbors speaking near the vending machines. Did you see the video? One whispered. I saw both, the other replied. The way she kept pressing him. I can't believe she didn't stop when she was told who he was. Trisha tightened her grip on the parcel, picking up her pace. She didn't say anything. She didn't confront them. But her jaw clenched, and her steps quickened as she tried to escape the ripple of conversations surrounding her. Across the complex, in the management office, the atmosphere was different. Riley sat at his desk, reviewing the incident reports that had already started coming in. He wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time someone had complained about Trisha's confrontational behavior. Small issues had popped up throughout her short time living there. Arguments over parking spots, disputes about hallway noise, accusations that neighbors were watching her through peepholes. Nothing major individually, but together they painted a pattern. He heard a knock on the doorway and looked up to see assistant manager Nora Delgado stepping in. You've seen the videos, right? She asked. I have, he said. Both from this morning. And 3 statements from tenants so far. Nora sighed. I hate when things like this happen. I like to give new tenants the benefit of the doubt. But this is a lot. Riley nodded. We've dealt with disagreements before, miscommunications, arguments. But this is different. She targeted the owner, wouldn't back down. And the part where she threatened to call the police. That's serious. Nora leaned against the desk. Especially considering the context. We both know what could have happened if officers were dispatched. Riley didn't respond at first. His mind lingered not on policy, but on the image of DeAndre standing calmly while she hurled accusations at him. DeAndre didn't deserve that. Nobody did. What does Mr. Willis want us to do? Nora asked after a moment. He hasn't asked for anything yet, Riley said. But this isn't just about him. It's about creating a safe living environment. If tenants are scared someone's going to run up to them demanding proof they belong here, we've got a problem. Nora lifted a stack of printed emails. We've got 5 more written statements already. People saying she's been confrontational before. Let me see, he said. She handed them over. Each one described interactions that didn't cross legal lines, but raised concerns. Stopping neighbors in the stairwell to question their visitors. Accusing a teenager of roaming the halls without reason. Confronting a delivery driver who left packages near the entrance. She's not adjusting to community living, Nora said softly. She's policing it. Riley closed the file. We need to talk to Mr. Willis before deciding the next step. Meanwhile, outside near the picnic tables, Ava and Damon sat across from each other, both still uneasy from the morning. You think she understands what she did? Ava asked. Damon shook his head. Not yet. She's too focused on defending herself. Ava sighed. I don't like seeing anyone humiliated. But she pushed something that could have gotten dangerous. Damon stared toward the leasing office. Honestly, I'm more concerned about Mr. Willis. He handled it better than I would have. He always does, Ava said. He's patient to a fault sometimes. Nearby, a couple named Janelle and Mason approached, holding iced coffees. You two saw everything, right? Janelle asked. Most of it, Ava replied. She's telling people she was just doing her job as a resident, Mason said with raised eyebrows. Whatever that means. Ava shook her head. She wasn't doing anything but antagonizing him. Janelle sat down. You know management's going to have to deal with this. There's no way they let something like this slide. Trisha, walking past on her way to Building B, overheard that last part. She stopped abruptly. Excuse me? Are you talking about me? Everyone exchanged a look before Ava answered honestly. We're talking about what happened this morning. Trisha set her hands on her hips. You don't know the whole story. We saw the whole story, Damon said. We were there. And you made it worse by filming, Trisha snapped. You put me in a terrible position for no reason. You put yourself there, Ava replied calmly. Nobody forced you to accuse him. Trisha's eyes sharpened. I felt uncomfortable. That should matter. It matters, Ava said. But so does how you handled it. You didn't ask a question. You launched into accusations. Trisha swallowed hard, then looked toward the leasing office. I'm filing a complaint. All of you will see. Management will understand why I reacted the way I did. But as she marched away, none of them believed that. Because she didn't know yet that management had already begun the official review. But within a few hours, everything she thought she controlled would start shifting under her feet. And what management decided next would determine the entire direction of the fallout. By mid-morning, the leasing office felt different. Not because anything inside had changed, but because nearly everyone stepping through the doors now carried the same look. Curiosity mixed with second-hand embarrassment. People whispered near the coffee machine, lowered their voices when Trisha walked past, then raised them again once she was out of earshot. She came back to the office on her own, shoulders tight, fingers tapping anxiously against her phone. Whatever confidence she had shown earlier had thinned out, replaced by the stubborn determination of someone trying to regain control of a situation slipping from her hands. Riley looked up from his desk as she entered. Can I help you with something, Trisha? Yeah, she said, lifting her chin. I want to review the documents again, the ones he showed me earlier. She tried to sound firm, but there was a shaky edge to her voice, a small fracture that made her words less forceful than she intended. Riley kept his expression neutral. I can show you what you saw earlier, but everything Mr. Willis presented is real. There's nothing questionable here. I didn't say it was questionable, she argued quickly. I just want to look again, in private. He hesitated, then pulled out the folder from before and placed it on the desk. Property deeds, ownership transfer from his father's estate, renovation permits, inspection approvals. Each page stamped, signed, dated. Trisha flipped through the documents as if expecting to find some kind of inconsistency. Her eyes darted across each line with growing frustration. "You're telling me he owns all 3 buildings?" she said. "All 3, Riley confirmed. "And the parking lots, the office, the maintenance sheds, the pathways, the fences, everything inside this property line." Her jaw flexed. She wasn't used to being wrong, and she wasn't ready to accept it now. "And you're telling me he has access to every floor, every storage room, every gate?" "That's what property owners do," Riley replied. She turned the page harder than necessary. "It just feels unprofessional to show up that early without notifying tenants." Riley's patience thinned for the first time. "He manages over 130 units. His schedule isn't built around tenant preferences." She looked up sharply. "So my safety doesn't matter?" "That's not what I said." "Well, that's what it sounds like." Before Riley could respond, the door opened and DeAndre stepped inside, holding a roll of building plans. He stopped short when he saw her. "Didn't expect you back," he said, plainly. She stiffened. "I'm reviewing the paperwork." "You saw it earlier." His tone wasn't aggressive, just factual. "What exactly are you looking for now?" She closed the folder, but kept her hand on it, gripping the edge. "I'm trying to understand why you think it's okay to walk around like you own the place." He raised an eyebrow. "Because I do." The silence that followed stretched just long enough to sting. Riley shifted awkwardly in his chair, glancing between them. DeAndre placed the building plans on the counter. "Contractors need measurements for the new fire doors in Building C. That's why I'm here again." He paused. "If you had simply asked a question earlier instead of making accusations, the morning would have gone very differently." "That's not fair," she said quickly. "I reacted to what I saw." "And you doubled down even after people told you who I was," he replied. "You didn't back off. You kept pushing. You pulled out your phone. You threatened to call the police for unlocking a door." Trisha's cheeks reddened. "Well, maybe if you didn't act suspicious." Riley cut her off. "Trisha, stop. You're not helping yourself." She pressed her lips together, refusing to answer. DeAndre didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer, didn't try to intimidate her. He simply spoke in the tone of someone who had nothing to hide. "My father bought this property when I was a teenager," he said. "I took over after he passed. I spent years renovating these buildings myself. Every coat of paint, every contractor hired, every change in policy. You're living in something my family built." Her eyes flickered, and something broke through her defensiveness. A crack of realization she couldn't hide. "All I wanted," DeAndre continued, "was to open a door so work could get done. That's it. Nothing dramatic." He wasn't insulting her. He wasn't lecturing her. He was stating facts with the calm precision of someone who'd lived them. And for the first time all morning, Trisha didn't have a comeback ready. Riley cleared his throat. "Trisha, I think you've seen what you needed to see." She placed the folder back on the counter, but didn't meet anyone's eyes. As she turned to leave, a small crowd outside caught sight of her. Their voices dipped momentarily. A few shook their heads. Others whispered to each other. She walked past them with her chin slightly raised, but the embarrassment followed her out the door like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Inside, DeAndre let out a quiet exhale. "This is going to get around fast," he said. "It already has," Riley answered. But what none of them realized yet was that the conversations spreading among the tenants were starting to reach management leadership. And once those conversations turned into formal reports, everything for Trisha would take a sharp turn. By the time they stepped back out of the leasing office, the morning had shifted. Neighbors who normally hurried to their cars before work were slowing down, whispering, glancing from Trisha to DeAndre, as if trying to piece together what they'd just heard through half-open doors and shared hallways. Word in a complex travels faster than any text chain, and in less than 10 minutes, people already had their version of the story. Trisha stood stiffly by the walkway, her arms wrapped around herself like she was bracing for a storm nobody else felt. She didn't look at DeAndre. She didn't look at Damon or Ava. Instead, she stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the stares landing on her from the balconies above. DeAndre didn't rush her. He walked toward the back building where a contractor van was scheduled to arrive. But when he saw she wasn't leaving, he stopped and turned slightly. "If you still want clarity, walk with me," he said. "I'll show you anything you need to see." His tone wasn't confrontational, but it had a weight to it, an unspoken message that he wasn't hiding, wasn't avoiding, wasn't afraid to let the truth sit plainly in the open. "I'm not going anywhere with you until someone explains why you think you can show up before sunrise and act like you run the place," Trisha answered. Her voice thinner now, but still sharp. Damon muttered under his breath, "He literally does run the place." Ava nudged him to stop, even though she agreed. DeAndre didn't seem bothered. He just said, "Let's walk," and started toward the maintenance gate. After a long hesitation, Trisha followed, keeping several feet behind him like she didn't want anyone to think she was cooperating. Damon and Ava walked too, partly to make sure things didn't flare again, partly because they already knew this moment would confirm everything. They reached a small utility area tucked between the buildings. Nothing dramatic, just a metal shed and a row of meters that tenants rarely noticed. DeAndre pulled a ring of keys from his pocket and unlocked the shed. Inside were tools, spare fixtures, documents, and access binders, all organized, all labeled, all things only a person in charge would handle. "You ever see a tenant with this?" he asked calmly, holding up a clipboard filled with repair orders signed by him. Trisha didn't answer. He lifted a box containing new smoke detectors and placed it on a nearby table. "These were approved yesterday. I come early because contractors need access before tenants wake up." Still nothing from her. He gestured toward the meters. "Property owners handle inspections. That's why I'm here. That's why I unlock buildings. I didn't approach you. You approached me, demanding proof in a parking lot I've walked through since my father bought this place 30 years ago." That last part hit harder than anything else he'd said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply real. Trisha shifted her weight. A flicker of uncertainty passed across her face, the kind a person gets when they realize their confidence might have been built on a misunderstanding they refused to double-check. But she didn't apologize. Instead, she pointed at the shed. "Anyone could stage that," she murmured, though even she didn't sound convinced. Ava let out a breath through her nose. "Trisha, come on. You're reaching for things that aren't there." Damon stepped closer to the doorway. "And we're not recording because we want to embarrass you. We're recording because what you said earlier could have put a man in danger. Think about that for a second." Trisha's eyes darted toward him. "You don't get to decide who feels threatened. I did. That's it. And he's the one you threatened to call the police on," Ava replied. "What exactly did he do? Unlock a door?" Trisha clenched her hands tightly. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't ask," Ava countered. "You accused." DeAndre didn't jump in. He let them talk. He let the weight of the conversation settle wherever it needed to. When he finally spoke, his words were measured. "Trisha, you asked me to prove myself. I did. You wanted access. You got it. I'm not here to fight with you." He paused, letting the silence press lightly between each word. But respect goes both ways. The contractor van pulled into the lot, rolling toward them. The driver leaned out the window. "Morning, Mr. Willis. I'm here for the detector install." "Right on time," DeAndre replied. "Give me 1 minute." The driver nodded and parked. Trisha watched the exchange, the casual familiarity, the way the contractor spoke to him like he had done so many times before. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Ava whispered to Damon, "She gets it now. She just doesn't want to admit it," he whispered back. DeAndre turned to Trisha once more. "If you still have questions, I'll answer them. But I'm not going to stand out here arguing about my right to access my own property." Trisha stared at the ground. She didn't agree. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge anything. She simply stepped back and muttered, "I'll think about what I want to do next." And that was the closest thing she gave to a retreat. DeAndre gave a small nod, not approving, not dismissive, just acknowledging the moment for what it was. "You do that." He walked toward the contractor van, leaving Trisha with the neighbors who had witnessed everything from start to finish. But even as she stood there, trying to gather herself, she didn't realize that others had already started talking. But what spread through the complex in the next hour would carry more weight than anything she could say in her own defense. Trisha stepped into the leasing office with the same energy she had carried across the parking lot, sharp, determined, and absolutely convinced she was in the right. She stood near the entrance, arms crossed, breathing fast. DeAndre walked ahead of her, not in a hurry, not irritated, just steady. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to long days, early mornings, and tenants who didn't always realize how much work went into keeping a complex running. Behind them, Ava and Damon stayed near the doorway, still recording. "We're only here to keep things clear," Ava said, her voice firm but not aggressive. "Trisha, please stop talking to him like he's doing something wrong." "I'm not talking to him any type of way," Trisha snapped. "I'm protecting my home. Don't start twisting my words." Before Ava could reply, the leasing office door swung open again, and property manager Riley Drummond stepped out from the inner hallway. He was in his early 40s, usually calm, usually patient, but his eyebrows lifted slightly when he saw the scene. "Morning," he said slowly. "Is something going on?" "Yes," Trisha answered before anyone else could speak. "There sure is. This man was trying to enter Building C without permission, and when I asked who he was, he refused to tell me anything. I want his access checked. I want to make sure this place is safe." Riley blinked. "Ma'am? That's DeAndre." She threw her hands up. "Oh, please. Everyone keeps acting like I'm supposed to just trust him because you say so. Have you even checked his ID? Anyone can say they work here." Damon let out a heavy sigh. "We know him because we've lived here longer than you. You've been here, what, 3 weeks? 3 weeks is plenty of time to see when something looks suspicious," she fired back. DeAndre didn't interrupt her. He waited for Riley to finish absorbing the situation, then walked around the counter and reached into a locked drawer. "I'm going to show her exactly who I am," he said, voice steady but edged with the weight of someone who'd had to explain himself far too many times. He set a thick black key fob on the desk. "This opens every building, not one apartment, not one floor, all of them." He placed a laminated ID beside it, his full name, photo, position, owner and director, Willis Residential Holdings. And then, almost as if he had expected this exact moment, he pulled out a thin folder containing updated property deeds, inspection permits, and renovation records. Each page had his signature. Trisha's eyes flicked over the items but didn't soften. "Anyone can print papers," she muttered. "I want real proof." Riley stepped toward her, his tone shifting. "Trisha, you asked for verification. You're looking at it. This is the landlord. He owns every unit in this place, including yours." She let out a sharp breath through her nose. "Well, maybe he should act like a landlord then instead of sneaking around at sunrise." DeAndre finally spoke again, still controlled. "I'm here early because contractors are coming today. That's why I was opening the building. If you had asked respectfully, you would have known that." Trisha rolled her eyes. "I don't need a lecture." Ava crossed her arms. "You might need some perspective, though." Damon looked at her phone screen. "And the moment you started threatening to call the police? That's where this crossed the line." Trisha spun toward him. "You don't get to decide what crosses the line for me. I felt uncomfortable. And you didn't stop even when we told you who he was." Ava said. "That's the part you're skipping." Trisha pointed toward them. "I don't need you two following me everywhere with your phones either. That's harassment." Riley raised his hand slightly. "Enough. Everyone, please. I need a moment with Mr. Willis." "No," Trisha insisted. I want someone to explain why he thinks he can walk into any building without telling tenants first. That's dangerous. He should know better. DeAndre gave a short breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief. More like a tired acknowledgement that this had gone too far. Trisha, I don't need permission to enter my own property. You approached me, not the other way around. She shook her head as if refusing to hear the words. I don't care what those papers say. Something about this whole situation feels wrong. Riley exchanged a glance with DeAndre, one that said this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The tension in the room thickened in a way no one could ignore. Ava whispered, "She's digging deeper, every second." Damon whispered back, "And she doesn't even see it." Trisha folded her arms again, jaw tight. If you expect me to just walk around pretending everything is normal after this, you're mistaken. I want to file a formal complaint. Riley inhaled, steadying himself. You can file whatever you want, but understand, this incident will be reviewed in full. That was the moment Trisha hesitated, not because she understood, but because she could tell the room had shifted away from her. Her voice lowered, defensive. I'm just trying to keep everyone safe. By accusing the owner? Ava said quietly. Trisha didn't reply. Riley finally said, Mr. Willis, let me get you what you need for the contractor appointment. DeAndre nodded once, then looked at Trisha. You wanted proof. You got it. She swallowed hard, but stubbornness kept her from backing down. Her words came out clipped. We'll see. But the office door hadn't even closed before news of what happened began spilling across the complex. But what spread among the residents next would push this situation far beyond Trisha's control. There are moments that flip a person's entire day upside down, and this one started the second Trisha Kellerman spotted a black man unlocking the front door of Building C as the sun was barely stretching over the rooftops. She didn't pause. She didn't breathe. She didn't even look around to see if anyone else found it strange. She just marched straight across the parking lot like she was stepping into a scene she believed she controlled. Hey! Hey! You! She shouted, her voice sharp enough to cut the quiet morning air. What do you think you're doing? You can't go in there unless you live here. Show me your key. Show me something. DeAndre Willis turned slowly, the metal door handle still in his hand. He wasn't startled, more like caught between confusion and disbelief at the way she approached him. He'd been unlocking this door for years. He lived 10 minutes away in Tempe, but he spent more time at this complex than any of his own tenants did. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step toward her. He just said, Ma'am, I'm opening the entry like I do every morning. Is something wrong? That response only seemed to set her off more. Don't play games with me, she snapped. I've seen you hanging around lately. You're not on my floor. I would know. So unless you can prove you actually belong here, I'm calling the police. Two residents across the lot, neighbors who walked their dogs before work, paused mid-conversation. One of them, Damon Ridley, lowered his coffee, squinting at the scene unfolding. Is she talking to Mr. Willis right now? He whispered to his friend, Ava Rennick. She can't be serious. Trisha pulled out her phone like she was preparing to film or report him. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a kind of a self-righteous adrenaline that made her believe she was doing something heroic. Ma'am, DeAndre repeated, firmer now, but still controlled. I'm not required to prove anything to you. Oh, really? She shot back. Because this is my building, and I won't let someone just walk in. People pay good money to live here. You think you can stroll in and… Ava stepped forward, quick and direct. Trisha, stop. That's the landlord. That's Mr. Willis. He owns the place. But instead of slowing down, Trisha's face twisted with irritation. Don't cover for him. I'm not stupid. Owners don't walk around at 6 in the morning unlocking doors. And why would he be here alone? This doesn't add up. Damon raised his phone slightly, beginning to record. Part of him out of worry that things might escalate. Part of him knowing exactly how this looked. And part of him wanting to protect DeAndre in case the situation spiraled out of control. DeAndre didn't move toward Trisha. He simply raised his key fob, and held it up in front of him. "This opens every building on the property," he said, with a measured tone. "I'm not here to explain myself to you, but I would like you to lower your voice." "Oh, so now you're telling me what to do?" she fired back. A couple of cars slowed as drivers turned into the parking lot. People glanced briefly, picking up enough from Trisha's pointed stance and raised phone to understand the tension. There was a heaviness in the air, made worse by how convinced she was that she had the right to question him. "You can call whoever you want," DeAndre said, stepping aside from the door and letting it swing open. "But if you're confused about who lives here or who works here, we can walk into the leasing office and clear it up." "I'm not going anywhere with you," she sneered. "You think I'm just going to follow some stranger inside a building? Absolutely not." Ava exhaled sharply. "Trisha, nobody's trying to trick you. You're making a huge mistake. You should stay out of it," Trisha snapped at her. "This is how break-ins happen. People pretending they belong." Damon stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Trisha, you're digging yourself into a hole. I'm telling you, that guy's the landlord." She ignored him. Her eyes stayed trained on DeAndre, as if trying to catch him slipping. DeAndre didn't argue. "I'll be in the office," he said calmly. "You're welcome to follow or not. But this conversation isn't going anywhere out here." He turned toward Building A, the small office tucked beside the main walkway. Ava and Damon followed behind, both recording now, both shaking their heads. Trisha hesitated, torn between pride and doubt, then stormed after them, muttering under her breath about people thinking they can just go wherever they want. The moment she stepped through the office door behind him, the story she thought she controlled began to slip right out of her hands. But she still didn't realize that this would be the moment her entire world shifted.